Oh no. Hold on a second. I promise. There we go. So, there's this thing that happens when you get serious about writing, or really any craft, where you sort of retroactively become embarrassed about where you came from. Like, you start reading the craft books, you pick up on the vocabulary, you're throwing around words like narrative, thorough line, thematic resonance. And somewhere in that process, you quietly file away. Son of a bee. Did again. Anyway, you quietly file away the stuff that actually made you fall in love with storytelling in the first place. Because it doesn't sound serious enough. It doesn't sound like something a real writer would do. And it's generally one of the stupidest things we do as creatives. It seriously is. Because here's what actually happened before you ever picked up a craft book, or watched a video essay about the hero's journey, or sat through screenwriter class where somebody explained the three-act structure like it was a revelation. You were already learning storytelling. You were already absorbing it. You were getting it handed to you in the most efficient delivery system that has ever existed for narrative education, which is stories you were completely obsessed with as a kid. And nobody talks about it. Nobody, well, nobody wants to talk about it, I should say, actually. Because it sounds childish, which, okay, yeah, it's some of it was specifically made for children. But that's not the point. The point is what it does, well, was doing to your brain without your permission. The point is that the reason you care about character development moments the way you do is because, well, actually, let me rephrase that. So the point is that the reason you care about character development the way you do, the reason certain emotional moments hit you harder than others, the reason you have strong, specific, sometimes completely unhinged opinions about a supporting cast or how stories should be handled, a lot of that was installed before you were old enough to understand writing. And I think that matters a lot, more than people are willing to sit with. So, when I was a kid, a little girl, when everybody else was into like Power Rangers, superheroes, well, I fell in love with Winx Club, especially the first two seasons. Favorite seasons, top notch, not gonna lie. Because not only was there magic and it had fairies in it, it was my introduction to how stories could inspire and still hold us in their thralls years later. And also, how to properly, and I will die on this hill, show how to tell the main story while giving detailed background stories to all the supporting characters. And I know exactly what some of you just did. You either went, oh my god, same, or you just went, okay, a fairy cartoon? And to that second group, please stay. Because I promise this is going somewhere that matters regardless of whether you've seen a single episode. See, this isn't really about Winx Club. It's about what Winx Club did that most adult targeted narratives don't figure out. And that's the part that actually blows my mind when I think too hard about it. Oh my goodness gracious. I'm so sorry, guys. Ugh. I thought, oh my god. Technical difficulties. Anyway, okay. So where was I? Okay. Okay, maybe I shouldn't go on breaks for a bit. That's okay. We have good things to talk about. All right, so I don't want to jump straight into the analysis without actually setting up why this whole conversation exists, which is we're already really, really bad at crediting our actual influences. Not the ones we name drop, not the ones that sound impressive, but the real ones. The ones that lived in us before we ever understood a framework. And this is the pattern I see in creatives. And this is the mistake I keep seeing specifically in creatives who are trying to level up, who are past the beginner stage but haven't quite locked in their voice or instincts yet. They spend enormous amounts of time studying craft from a technical standpoint and almost no time interrogating their gut instincts. Like, they know what a cheat sheet is. They know what a character wants versus needs looks like on paper. But then they'll also have this clear sense of the story feels wrong, or a character doesn't land, or something is missing and I don't know why. And it's legit. They don't know where that feeling is because it has to come from somewhere. It's not nothing. It's not talent, not intuition in some mystical sense. It's the accumulated weight of every story that's ever grabbed you by the hair or the collar and refused to let go. And if you haven't gone back and looked at what those stories were doing technically, you're basically operating on instinct without the language to refine it, which works until it doesn't. And this is what annoys me. We spend so many times studying stories we're supposed to study, the canon, the classics, the stuff that's been anointed as legitimate literature, or prestige television, or whatever the current benchmark of serious storytelling is. And those are worth studying, absolutely. But, however, I'm not going to tell you to skip the classics, actually. But I think we treat that as the whole picture, and it's not. See, the full picture includes everything that shaped your brain before you knew shaping was happening. Which for me, and I'm willing to bet for some of you, includes some stuff that doesn't get cited in writing spaces. Fairy tales that were read to you before you could read yourself. Animated shows with more emotional nuance than people give them credit for. Films that hit you in ways you didn't have the language for yet. And the thing that connects all of those, the actual craft thread that runs for them, is what I want to talk about, because I think it's more sophisticated than we give it credit for. So let's start with fairy tales. My favorite thing. Because this is where the foundation actually is. And I think you have to understand the layer before anything else clicks. So the Grimm's fairy tales, and I mean the actual Grimm's, not the sanitized versions, not the Disney versions, the actual ones where things get dark and weird and deeply unhinged occasionally. Well, those stories are not simple. They look simple. They're told simply. Actually, hold on to that thought. Case in point. Actually, I think that every writer and reader and creator out there needs to have this. Because it's just good. Like, yes, it's not in stuff we understand yet. And although they are told simply, the architecture is doing extraordinary work. Like, think about it. I mean, the fact that they have survived as long as they have, it's got to tell you something. And also that they're recognized as story structure. That's not an accident. What fairy tales figured out, and nobody talks about this, is how to make the stakes feel cosmic without requiring the reader to invest a lot of time in getting there. You get your setup in a few sentences. You understand who the character is, what they want, what's in their way, and then the story moves. No world building preamble, no extended backstory, just here's the solution, here's the thing that's wrong, and here's what it's going to cost to fix it. And that economy of information is something that modern writers consistently underestimate. And seriously, like, there's a reason that when you read a fairy tale, you feel the emotional weight of it immediately. You feel it before you've technically had time to invest in it. And it's because these stories have been tuned over generations through oral traditions, through countless retellings, to target the emotional core as effectively as possible. They went through a kind of evolutionary pressure that most individual writers don't experience. Every version that survived was the version that worked on the audience. The ones that didn't land got dropped. That's not a small thing to internalize. That's basically 1,000 years of user testing. And about that, And this is where I think people mess up when they talk about fairy tales as a writing influence. Because the conversation goes straight to archetypes: the hero, the villain, the helper figure, the trickster. And those matter, absolutely. I'm not dismissing that. But the conversation tends to flatten the stories into symbolism and loses the sight of what they're doing emotionally. And the emotional mechanics are where the real teaching is. Take transformation, which is in basically every story tell in some form. The beast becomes human, the girl becomes a queen, the poor boy becomes somebody worth noticing. Now, on the surface, that reads as wish fulfillment, and it is, partially. But it's also a really precise emotional instruction about what characters need to change in order to deserve what they want. Fairy tales are absolutely brutal about that. They don't let the character get the thing until the character has actually changed. See, the transformation is not cosmetic. It's earned. And if you look at the stories that failed the test, the ones where transformation is handed to the character without cost, then you end up with something that feels so hollow that we all know it on some level. We've always known it. I absorbed that as a kid before I had any language for it. I just knew when a story cheated. I knew that how the ending felt wrong. And looking back, it was because somewhere in the fairy tale saturation of early childhood, I'd been trained to expect that cost. I'd been trained to understand that the characters' change had to be proportional to what they received. See, that's a craft lesson. That's a genuinely sophisticated craft lesson that showed up in a book and a story about a spinning wheel, and a cursed girl before I was old enough to tie my shoes. Okay, so I want to connect this to something before I actually move on, because this is where Winx Club comes back in, and where I think the overlap is more interesting than it seems. So one of the things that the Grimm's fairy tales does really well, and this is something that the later, prettier versions tend to lose, is the idea that magic has rules. It has costs. It has logic. The wish granted by the fish and the fisherman and his wife comes with escalating consequences. The deals made with Rumpelstiltskin comes with terms. Even the helpful magic with the fairy godmother, the enchanted objects, they operate within constraints. You get the dress, but you have to be gone by midnight. You get the path through the forest, but you can't look back. That logic, that there is a system underlining the magical elements, and that system has teeth, is world building. I mean, stripped down to the minimalist of it. See, world building, well, it gives you this particular set of world building, I should say. It gives you a complete sense of how the world operates. You don't need a map. You don't need an appendix, even. You just need to understand the magic in the world costs something, and the story will show you what. See, Winx Club does a version of this that is considerably more elaborate, and for good reason. It's a long-formed serialized narrative than a short story. Thank God. But the principle is the same. See, the magic in Winx Club isn't just sparkles and transformation sequences. Every character has a specific power tied to a specific domain and tied to a specific identity, and those powers have limits. See, Bloom is the fairy of the dragon flame, which is the most powerful magic in existence. And for the first 2 seasons, that power is directly connected to her not yet knowing who she is. Her power grows as her identity solidifies. Her weakness is tied to her uncertainty. That's not just lore. That's characterized development delivered through world building. And which is wild because a lot of stories aimed at much older audiences fumble this exact move. When your character's magical ability is thematically linked to their internal arc, you created a feedback loop between plot and character development that makes everything in the story matter. Bloom's power struggles aren't just seen in action sequences of tension, they're character arc tensions. The same scene is doing two jobs at once. Oh, love it. But wait, okay, the supporting cast. So this is the hill I mentioned I will die on, and I genuinely believe that Winx Club did this better than most adult narratives do with everything I've ever watched. And let me explain exactly what I mean. So this is an issue, and I don't know why this is a thing, but there's this thing that happens constantly in stories, books, television, films, across every medium that I find genuinely insulting and maddening and annoying as hell. The supporting cast exists to serve the protagonist's story. The friends are there to worry about the main character. The sidekicks are there to make the main character look good. The ensemble is there to bounce exposition off the lead and occasionally sacrifice themselves for the dramatic, of course. And we've normalized this through so thoroughly that when a story actually bothers to give the supporting characters their own fully functional interior lives, it feels like a gift, if I'm being honest. It feels like the writer went above and beyond, but I'm sorry, no, it's not above and beyond. It's how it should be done. And I know this because the first 2 seasons of Winx Club showed me what it looked like to do it the right way before I had any frame of reference, an idea that most stories weren't doing it. Here's what those seasons did. Every member of the Winx, Stella, Flora, Musa, Tecna, Asia, or Iasia, depending on who you are in the crowd, had an origin, had a world, had parents with complicated dynamics, had personal stakes that had nothing to do with Bloom's storyline. Stella's parents were getting divorced and she was caught in between. Musa's mother was dead and her relationship with her father was... well... anyway. Tecna's entire culture was emotionally repressed and she was trying to figure out what feeling things actually meant for her. Flora was the soft one, but she had her own fears, her own specific wounds. None of this was background noise. None of it was character shorthand. It was actual narrative. It had arcs, and it paid off because you watched these characters change in response to things that happened in their own lives, not just in response to things that happened to Bloom. Love that. And the thing is this is also what makes the story, Bloom's story, stronger if you think about it, because when you know who these people actually are to her, like what you've seen, what they've survived, what they're afraid of, what they're quietly carrying, well, their choice to stand with her means something totally different than if they're just her friends. The stakes of the ensemble become additive. So you're not just worried about Bloom, you're worried about all of them. Specifically for specific reasons, because you know them. That's how supporting casts should work. And the fact that a cartoon aimed at young girls was executing this more thoughtfully than half of the serious fantasy epics I've read as an adult. I mean, should I be surprised anymore? But I was when I actually started analyzing it. So, what ends up happening in a lot of adult targeted fantasy, because it's relevant, is that the supporting cast gets treated as function over identity. Like, you have the wise mentor, and you know this because the book tells you. And the mentor exists to give the protagonist information and then die or disappear when the protagonist no longer needs them. You have the loyal friend, and the friend is loyal, and their entire emotional existence is oriented around the protagonist's journey. You have the love interest, and the love interest exists to, well, you know. It's not that these characters are bad or unlovable. Some of them are incredibly compelling. Like Star Wars comes to mind. Or Star Trek. Or, pick a show. Anyway. But the thing is their most compelling qualities are always in the service of the main character, the protagonist. Their wounds and their histories are revealed when it's relevant to the protagonist's arc. Their most important scenes happen in conversation with the protagonist. Winx Club didn't do that. And I want to be very specific about why that matters beyond it's just more realistic. Which it is, but that's almost too obvious to bother saying. It matters because the world felt populated. It felt like a place that anyway, where things matter when the camera isn't on the lead character. See, there's a difference between a world that feels alive and a world that feels like a stage set. And that feeling, that sense of genuine populated space, is something you can't fake in a description. You can build it but only by actually caring about who the other people are in your story. As people, not as narrative tools. And this is something that, looking back, I internalized hard. I have very strong feelings about ensemble casts, if you can't tell. About supporting characters deserving their own gravity. And about the whole story being richer when you invest in everyone instead of just the lead. And I know where that comes from. It comes from growing up with a show that treated all 6 of the main characters like they had their own story happening. Okay, but I want to get into Spirited Away for a second because it fits perfect and it demonstrates the same thing but from a different angle. So Spirited Away is technically a children's film. Miyazaki made it for kids, specifically for the daughters of friends who were visiting the Ghibli studio and seemed bored by the movies he was making. That's the origin story. He made it for bored 10-year-olds. And it is one of the most emotionally and symbolically dense pieces of storytelling I've encountered in, well, any medium that I've encountered. Let me just say that. The thing about Spirited Away, and this is interesting, is that it never explains itself. I mean, think about it. It doesn't hand you a mythology document. It doesn't introduce the spirit world with a dump. You're dropped into it the same way Chihiro is dropped into it. Confused, slightly overwhelmed, and just trying to figure out how this place works, but also trying not to get turned into a pig. And that choice, that decision to let the audience experience the disorientation alongside the character, is doing really specific things. It's building atmosphere through absence. I mean, think about it. It's not explaining the rules up front, but it's making you piece together how the world functions as the main character figures it out for herself. And the world feels genuinely infinite. It feels like there's more of it than you're seeing. Every background character, every glimpsed custom, every unexplained ritual has weight because you understand that the world has internal logic, even if it hasn't been spelled out for you. That is world building confidence that I aspire to. And this is where it falls apart for a lot of writers and creators, particularly in fantasy and speculative fiction writers. Because the instinct when you've built a complex world is to share the complexity, to show it off, to make sure the reader knows what you know. But Miyazaki trusted the world so much that it could convey itself throughout interactions. He trusted that Chihiro's experience in the world was sufficient enough. He didn't need to explain the bathhouse's functions in detail because watching Chihiro figure out how it worked it was more illuminating than any explanation he could say. And here's what that taught me, or rather what it reinforced, because Winx Club had already planted the seed. The audience doesn't need to understand everything to feel the weight of a world. They need to feel like more exists. They need to feel like this world has histories and customs and corners that they haven't seen. And you create that by not including everything, but by being so internally consistent that what you don't include is implied. There's a character in Spirited Away that I specifically want to talk about because they are a masterclass in what I was saying about supporting casts, which is Lin, Haku, and Kamaji. These characters, especially Lin, have long histories in the world. They have relationships, loyalties, griefs, things they've survived, and you get glimpses. You get enough that you know something is there. Lin's irritation and her care for Chihiro exist together in a way that's immediately real because Lin, is clearly a fully formed person with her own stuff going on. But the film never stops to explain her whole deal. It just trusts you to feel her depth without needing her autobiography. That's the move. Implying fullness without filling every creature. And it's the same effect as Winx Club does. The world feels populated by people, not by plot functions. So yeah. Anyway, same principle, completely different execution, different tonal register, but same results, which is crazy because both of them are doing it for audiences we've collectively decided don't deserve that level of craft. So here's what I think is actually happening when we absorb these stories young, and I may be off, but I think we're not just learning what we like. We're learning what we expect from a story. We're building a subconscious benchmark that we will spend the rest of our creative lives measuring things against. And when something fails to meet that benchmark, when a world feels empty, when a supporting character is hollow, when magic feels arbitrary, we know. We feel it. We just don't know why we feel it or where the expectation comes from. And this is why going back to those early influences is actually useful as craft exercises, and not just as nostalgia. When you go back and watch or read the thing that first made you go, oh, I want to do this, and you look at your actual craft vocabulary, you can actually identify what it was doing that you absorbed without being able to name it. I went back to Winx Club through that lens, and I found the supporting cast architecture. I went back to the fairy tales with that lens, and I found the transformation as cost mechanics. I went back to Spirited Away, and I found the populated world technique. And none of those things I learned from a craft book first. I learned them from stories that trusted their audience enough to do the work without announcing it. And I think there's something important about the fact that all three of these examples are aimed at young audiences. Like, it's not incidental. There's something about storytelling for children that forces a certain kind of clarity, a certain kind of emotional directness that's more sophisticated narratives sometimes let themselves avoid like the plague. So you can't hide behind it when your audience is 10. You can't obscure the stakes in clever language. You have to actually be genuinely clear about what the story is doing, because the audience will bail immediately if they're not engaged. And that constraint produces some of the most efficient, emotionally precise storytelling that exists. See, the Grimm's brothers weren't writing for children the way we think of children's content now, but the oral tradition that fed into their work absolutely was calibrated for listeners of all ages, which imposes the same demand. Be clear, be direct, make the stakes legible, don't make people work to care. That's advice I carry from everything I write now into. And it comes from stories I dismissed for years just as stuff I watched as a kid. And this is where it starts getting dumb. Like, this is the damage. The real damage. When writers don't interrogate their early influences. They inherit the instincts but lose the source. So what ends up happening is they know they care about a certain type of dynamics, but they can't articulate why, because they can't defend it in critique sessions and they can't refine it consciously. They know they want their world to feel lived in, but they don't know what technique creates that feeling, so it doesn't land in their work. They don't know what's wrong. The vocabulary that comes from studying craft is generally useful. I'm not saying otherwise, but that alone, without any emotional foundation of why these things matter to you, makes you technically competent as a writer who produces work that doesn't land. Because craft without personal investment is just a puzzle. You can solve it correctly and still produce something hollow. See, the thing that gives your writing specificity, is where it comes from, what you care about, what your gut has been trained to notice. And your gut was trained before you knew training was happening. So, like, I'm sorry, but when somebody tells me their influences are only serious stuff that's approved for citation in serious circles, I actually don't believe them. But not fully. Like, I believe those things influence them, but I don't believe that's the whole story. I don't believe your earliest formative narrative education came from McCarthy and not from whatever you were obsessed with at the age of 8 or 6 or 5, if you could remember that far back. Because writers who are willing to look at that second thing honestly, those who are willing to go, okay, fine, I learned half of what I know about emotional storytelling from a cartoon about fairies. Let me actually explain that. Well, those are the writers who can be specific about what they're doing and why. Those are the creators who know where their instincts come from, which means they can consciously build on them instead of hoping they fire at the right moments. Where was I? Okay. So here's what I've been sitting with lately, and I don't have the perfect answer for this. I've been thinking about the difference between stories that teach craft by doing it and stories that perform craft by announcing it. Because there's a version of sophisticated storytelling where the technique is visible, where you can see the structure, and that's not a bad thing. Transparency has value. It's how you learn. But there's another kind of storytelling where it's so embedded that you feel the effect without never ever knowing the cause. And those tend to be the stories that stick for decades. Winx Club stuck. The first 2 seasons hit something real, and they hit it efficiently. And they hit it without ever feeling like they were trying to be important. They were just telling the story, their stories. And they were doing their things. And the craft was there, but it was invisible. It was in the service of the feeling rather than the other way around. And I think that's a good thing, honestly. It should be our goal, actually. Because the end point of all craft study, all the technique building, is that you stop needing to see the scaffolding. You internalize it well enough that you can build the thing without thinking how the construction works. And then what you've got is a story that feels like it just exists, fully formed, the way the best stories feel they couldn't have been any other way. And the thing is, the stories that got me there aren't the ones I expected. The stories that did the deepest early installation work were not the ones anyone would list as curriculum. They were the ones I came to first, before I knew what I was looking for, before there was any agenda, before I was trying to be a writer. When I was just a kid who fell in love with fairies and magic and worlds that felt bigger on the inside than the outside. I don't know if I would have become a creative or a writer. Creative person? Anyway. I don't know if I would have become her if I hadn't, well, got my education from those. I don't know if the instincts would be there. I generally can't trace a straight line to caring about ensemble casts the way I do without Winx Club being somewhere at the beginning of it. And I used to be embarrassed about that, but now I'm not. Because that's the thing. Why would I be embarrassed about where my craft actually came from? The only thing that would be embarrassing is pretending it came from somewhere else. So, I'm curious what you guys think about this, whether you're watching live or the replay or just listening while doing laundry like a responsible person. What was that story for you? What was that thing you loved before you had the language for craft? Structures, character arcs, any of it. Because I genuinely think those early stories leave fingerprints on the kind of creator you become. Go back to the stories that grabbed you before you were trying to be good at storytelling. You might find pieces of your instincts creatively sitting there like, hey, look who finally decided to grace us with their presence. So, if you're watching the replay, leave it in the comments below. And if this made you think about your own early influences differently, then that's kind of the point. So, do with that what you will. And if you want more around this kind of thing, check out my link tree below. If this actually made you think, go ahead and like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. This is